Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the south-afrifur podcast. You're listening to myself, Ivic Wolf, and my co-host is Scratch, as always.
Yo.
And our guest for this evening is Erkhyan.
Hello.
I hope I pronounced it correctly.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
that's okay.
Okay. So, Erkhyan, if you could possibly just tell us a little bit about yourself, just very basically, like who you are, where you're from, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I, uh, I'm an artist from Antananarivo, Madagascar. I was born and grew up here, and I still live here. Uh, I've been in the furry fandom since around 2005. I think that's the basics.
Mm-hmm. And like, how or when did you find the fact? And
Hello.
hello, can you hear me?
Sorry.
Yeah, you
Yes,
just
no
broke up a
worries.
Yeah,
little bit.
it's been a
Was it me?
Yeah, you just broke up a little
Yeah.
bit.
Crap. Okay, how or when
Uh,
did you find the fandom?
the short version is I was on fan forums for Black Sad,
Mm-hmm.
and someone linked me to DeviantArt, and from there I found furry comics and other furry artists
Mm-hmm.
online.
Mm-hmm. Like anything specific that you were looking for was where or how did that?
Like, what
So,
kind of
yeah.
artists did you find? Who were your influences?
Um, at first, it was just interest in furry comics, and to be fair, I was
Mm-hmm.
uh, I was in my time of coming out to myself as gay, so I was trying to see if someone, if I could find someone to talk with.
Mm-hmm.
And once I found a few forums, it was mostly just following the flow.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
Hmm.
It's always good to see that the fandom helps people sort of discover who they are, kind of thing.
Yeah. And I mean, like, especially when it comes to the idea of discovery and that sort of, like, I guess, perspective. Um, I'm not necessarily too clued up on, I guess, Madagascar's rulings around um, sex and sexuality, but like maybe just walk us through that. Like, does it allow for that kind of, I think, connection, or is it a bit more authoritarian?
Uh, I'd say the culture is uh, very patriarchal and not very gay friendly, but uh, so far there is no explicitly homophobic law aside from marriage laws.
Okay. Does I mean?
But
Hmm? Go.
uh, just saying, there are friendly places, but in general, it's more LGBT people here are discreet and keep it that way.
So that would be the same for, I guess, exposing oneself as being furry, right?
For furry, it's kind of special because people don't mind it so much, mostly because people don't know what furry is. So most of the time, I am their exposure to anything furry.
Hey, that's cool. It's nice that you could be sort of like like the gateway for people to the furry fandom. It's always interesting to find people who are interested and willing to listen regarding that.
So when it comes to both your art and your writing, how did you get into those sort of particular parts of the fandom?
I've been drawing furry characters since the 90s, but well, I didn't get good. I'd say I didn't get good enough until I started interacting with other artists who helped me. How would I say? Before that, I was mostly improvising, and other people then showed me a few basics, so I could get better. It's about the same for writing. I've been trying a bit since the 90s, and well, I haven't produced much yet in writing, but it's gotten better since I started interacting with other writers.
And with that interaction with other writers, with other artists, obviously you're saying that you've improved, but like in what perspectives has, I guess, that ability to start talking to people within your field sort of influenced you? Who are your biggest influences, as well as how have they affected your work?
Mostly, I would say one artist who helped me start was Chelsea Kenna. She posted a few tutorials, and I started following them. And then I started integrating influences from comics such as Black Sad and Light of the Amalou, a French series. Yeah, hello?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, we're still here.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah, we're just listening to the story, sort of. Sorry.
Okay. Actually, yes. Rakuin mentions that you found the south-afrifur forum in 2012. Like, how did that happen?
I think someone linked me to the forum, but I didn't stay for long because, let's say, I seem not very connected to the community yet. Mostly my issue with most communities is I'm a bit isolated here, so I don't know how to integrate myself into communities established in other cultures.
Okay.
Yes. Speaking of, is there any sort of furry scene in Madagascar? Or do you know of other furries in the area?
As far as I know, there are two of us in the entire country, and before 2016, I think I was the only one.
Yeah, that's a yeah.
Or maybe,
Yeah, I always find it interesting that it's like how people find the furry fandom, and like in certain countries it's just not as prevalent as others, because Madagascar you wouldn't expect to have much of a furry scene, to be perfectly honest, but it's good to know there's at least one other person that you can sort of share stories with.
yeah, I'd say the issue here is the furry fandom is very online, but the internet is not something most people here use, except
Really?
for work and yeah, Facebook, and that's about all. Yeah.
Okay. So, Rakuin, sorry, not Rakuin, Advolf has a question stating there must be challenges of being a furry in Madagascar that most of us have never even thought of. Again, we sort of covered some of it: internet access, things like traveling to conventions, and getting or sending money online, things like that. Like, how do you find it to be, like you've mentioned, it's isolating in some senses, but like how do you get around that?
Yeah, I've mostly been just online because travel from Madagascar is flying, and flying is just out of reach for most people here, including me. I haven't left the country since 2002. And as for money, there are starting to be solutions, but right now it's just very impractical.
Yeah, same here for us, unfortunately. Like from I know for me, it's definitely difficult to travel out of the country.
Yeah,
Mm.
it's visas and which country are you from, for instance, because that's a question that people ask these days. I know
Mhm.
that, what's the word, sometimes certain countries have certain restrictions on other countries specifically because of the country itself.
Mm.
It's really just, it boggles the mind that in a day and age where you could, again, literally speak to somebody from Africa or anything like that, that we can't actually,
Travel as freely as we would have hoped.
yeah, or as frugally as we'd like.
Yeah, no, money is obviously a big drawback for this case.
Hmm. So when you joined the fandom, and obviously, I mean, you've been in the fandom for a fair amount of years. Do you think that the fandom itself, um, from its earlier days, from its, I guess, I'm going to sort of talk about from the '90s specifically because that was where the initial boom was. But do you think that the fandom itself has sort of specifically changed, and do you think that it's a positive change?
Uh, yeah, I haven't really thought of it, but mostly I consider that the fandom is more accessible nowadays, more friendly, even with a few problems. But I'd say it's more welcoming. It's less something you have to hide because yeah, there's always someone you can talk with. You can easily become friendly with other people. Yeah, I'd say it's less small groups than it used to be.
Do you feel that the fact that there are less small groups, for instance, I mean, when we're talking small, we're talking about what's it like, little groups like 15 to 20 different people that would all be online at the same time, or are you talking about like 30 or 40? What, like,
It's
define
it's
small?
it's more that uh, it used to be that people were more on specific forums and and as far as I can tell, people didn't really check outside their groups. But nowadays, with social media, it's uh, it's easier to find other people who might have the same interests. Uh, well,
Mm,
that's about all I can say, I think, because
okay.
yeah,
So when you were interacting and when you started interacting, like I'm not sure if we properly covered this, but do you feel that your art has been able to change since you joined the fandom? Do you think that it did enough to sort of put you into the position that you're in? I mean, I've seen some of your art already. It's absolutely amazing, by the way. Just comment,
Thanks.
but but like, do you feel that you're in a better position now with the fandom than you would have been otherwise?
Yeah. Uh, Mostly it without the fandom, I don't think I could have spent more energy in art. Yeah, most of my inspiration to draw is from furry subjects and all that. And most of the people who who've taught me something were furries or furry adjacent. So yeah, without the furry fandom, I wouldn't be much of an artist and not much of a writer either.
Mm? Go, Scratch.
No, I was just gonna say like again we may have touched on this like how welcoming the furry fandom is, and along with that uh, how eager they are to help people out when they're like trying to learn how to draw or trying to improve their drawing or their writing or stuff like that. That's always been like one of the sticking points for me. The fact that uh, fellow furries are always very eager to help out.
So with that, and I know that we again something that we sort of tangentially touched in respect to perspective of the fandom, things like that. Now, obviously, with things like Twitter, with Facebook, in some senses, YouTube, and that kind of expansion of media, do you feel that the kind of commentary that's coming out there on all of those platforms, do you feel that it is a fair perspective? Do you feel that people who are able to sort of express themselves like that, do you feel that um, it is a fair representation of the fandom itself? And do you think that there's something or anything should change in the way that we are engaging with people outside of the fandom?
I feel that um, the furry fandom has the same problem as other groups. It's that the most visible, most publicly visible people aren't always how would I put it?
Not
Uh,
not the best role
the,
models.
not necessarily that, but not the most representative people.
Okay.
Something sometimes there's things like uh, someone who would be known mostly outside the furry fandom as the face of the furry fandom uh, wouldn't be actually so relevant inside the fandom itself, or vice versa. Let's say it's someone most of the fandom knows
Mm-hmm.
would be not very well known by outsiders or newcomers,
Hmm.
something like that.
Mm, that's very true.
And I mean, obviously, when it comes to the idea of, well, you'd call that, what's it, cult of personality, right?
Mm. Or furry celebrity, whatever you want to call it, I
Furry
suppose.
celebrity, yeah. Um, because again, like when I think we initially approached you, it was the entire idea that you're well known amongst circles that sometimes I also frequent, and the thing is that your name came up quite often. You're a polyglot, as which is
Yeah,
actually the initial place where I started like speaking to you about that. It's the idea that like within that the thought isn't necessarily about fame so much as it is about what you're, I guess, capable of doing. Do you feel that that's a more representative idea of what the furry fandom should be?
Yes, I'd say I'm not sure I can elaborate on it, but yeah, mostly it's that.
Because I mean, again, like you, it's it. One of the things, of course, that I think south-afrifur really, I guess, thrives in doing, um, is is the idea that um, we're able to connect on those kinds of levels. And the fact of the matter is that, again, polyglot groups out there. For those of you who are listening, there are groups that help uh, either improve other people's language ability or get people to learn new and different languages to be able to both understand on certain levels both the culture of the languages that they're beginning to speak, because language and culture are they're not distanced from one another. And I think that's something that I think polyglot groups like I can't remember what the name is because it doesn't it's escaped me. Yes, polyglot furries on Telegram does that. It allows for people to communicate with one another. I think it's Tuesdays, if I'm not mistaken, that
Yeah.
you're not allowed to speak English whatsoever.
Mhm.
You have to speak something other than English, and it's little things like that that I think should be the next step. And you can obviously sort of weigh in that we begin to understand both culturally as well as linguistically other languages around us. If we don't do that, then
Mhm.
obviously those languages die out. Um,
Mhm.
so what I'm leading into is first question: how many languages can you sort of fluently speak? Or speak. Let's just say speak.
I can write and
And right.
read Malagasy,
Mm-hmm.
French, and English fluently.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking is another matter. As you can hear,
Mm-hmm.
I have a bit of difficulty speaking, but essentially these are the three languages I use on a daily basis:
Mm-hmm.
Malagasy, French, and English.
And yes, actually, I'm going to very much. There's a whole bunch of questions that I've somehow missed. I don't know how this happened. But Advolf has another question here. Do you or Malagasy people in general consider Madagascar to be part of Africa? If not, which part of the world do you gravitate towards, or do you consider yourself a completely different and independent culture?
About that, Madagascar is very insular. Uh, Most people here consider Africa to be our neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
We, let's say, most people here think of themselves as Malagasy first,
Mm-hmm.
and then their appartenance to their respective ethnic groups.
Mm-hmm.
But mostly, it's still not usual here for people to think of themselves as African or Southeast Asian. It's
Mm-hmm.
just we're isolated like that.
Mm.
Most people don't think much of the world outside of Madagascar.
Okay. Um, Advolf then also asks, maybe just tell us a little bit about your persona. They think fossas are uber cool.
Yeah, about that. Uh, I ironically I've never seen one of them in real life, they're pretty discreet.
Hmm.
So you have to go to a foreign zoo to see them.
Hmm.
But about for a decade after I joined the fandom, I had another persona, a hybrid, canine
Hmm.
hybrid. I don't know.
It doesn't matter.
I I changed about 5 years ago,
Hmm.
and after a few experiments, I settled on Fus.
Hmm.
That's the native pronunciation
Hmm.
because it it's close to feline and
Hmm.
sometimes it's used in local folklore as a trickster. So I liked the association.
Hmm. Um, so more based around your, I guess, your online experiences. Do you feel that when you do express where you come from and things like that, do you feel that uh, it differs from hubs like obviously Europe and America, for instance? Like, do you feel that it's sometimes difficult speaking to Europeans or Americans for that? Do you feel?
Yeah, I'd say most people don't have much knowledge about Madagascar outside of that game and the movie.
Hmm.
And it's often a problem that I have to tell people that neither the movie nor the video game were very were accurate in representing Madagascar.
Hmm.
So mostly it's a lot of correcting misconceptions.
Hmm. Okay. James Bell just mentions hello from Bavaria. Bavaria?
Uh, Yeah. Mm.
And yeah, that's sure. It is interesting because I mean, obviously, everybody has to deal with the stereotypes from outside. For instance, I mean, I think just random tangent. South Africa has been represented in Marvel films as, irrespective of the vast majority of its population, um, to have 90 to 95% white policemen, for instance,
Or mercenaries.
or mercenaries. Yeah, there's that as well.
Mm.
However, you can probably state that when it does come to the guns for hire within South Africa, I'm going to assume that there is a vast majority of them people who came out of the 19 or the late 1980s and still had that wonderfully, please not sarcasm, beautiful bloodlust.
Mm.
Mhm.
Most of them probably work for ADT now.
Oh yeah, oh no. um, so obviously during many of our podcasts we speak about representation and how the fandom itself can be more accepting. In other words, it can be more accepting, but it sometimes very much isn't. What do you think we can do to address those particular issues?
Uh, to be honest, how would I say it? Uh, I wouldn't know really what to suggest because as I grew up here in Madagascar, I'm not very used to interacting with people or with groups in general or trying to make them work. So mostly I can just say, ah, yeah, got lost in my own thoughts again.
No worries.
Yeah. So I'd say I I'd just like people to be more curious about what happens outside the major hubs, like outside of Western Europe or North America.
No, that's a very good
Yeah,
good way of putting it, because yeah, one of the ways that we're trying to sort of get the word out is to bring in people from all different places, so we can help signal boost, help elevate that there are furries in other regions, and they view the world very differently than what the North Americans or the Europeans think that furries are.
And I mean, with that, obviously, we're also looking at other people like, say, Tonya and the groups that they're connected to,
Mm-hmm.
um, specifically about the idea that not only are they underrepresented, but they're also ignored. Um, very many sort of cases have come up about that, and um, it actually leads into sort of another question in respect to when people find out what your nationality is. How does the conversation change?
with me, most of the time, doesn't change much. There's some curiosity at first, but I'm lucky that there is no big issue with Madagascar's relationship with other cultures due to because of our isolation. So mostly I can just get by with informing people, giving a few facts, and as I said, telling them uh, what the popular culture, uh, how would say, correcting the misconceptions caused by popular culture,
Mm.
let's say. So there's not many of these.
Well,
Okay.
that's good.
Okay.
So, in respect to your writing, is like again, maybe just talk to us about what kind of writing you're doing. Second question, of course, like do you write specifically in English, in French? What's your first chosen language? Favorite genres, things like that.
I used to write in French. Uh, it just didn't work out, so I switched to English about a decade ago. It's a bit better. I uh, I still haven't finished anything big, but I'd say my favorite uh, subjects are fantasy and science fantasy.
Hmm.
Uh, in the last few years, I've been trying to integrate more Malagasy elements in my writing. I should probably finish something about that.
When
But
mhm, go.
No, sorry.
I don't know.
No, did you? Sorry, did you want to continue? Like,
No, no,
oh,
it's okay.
because I mean, when we talk about like Malagas elements, is that more sort of culturally? Would you? How would you like to integrate that?
Yeah, mostly I integrate local culture, names, some parts of folklore, and
Hmm.
Ah, that would be
Do you-
cool.
mm,
Yeah, that's
hmm.
definitely kind of a uh, how can I say, a nationality, a culture that I definitely haven't explored myself. So
Yeah.
seeing that in someone's writing would be
I,
really interesting.
yeah, I used to write more, let's say, generic
Hmm.
settings, but right now, the settings I would most like to develop are all based on Madagascar, Malagasy culture,
Mhm.
and all that.
Like if you could be able to give us a small rundown differences between is it would you say Malagasy eventually with the Y at the end? Or is
Uh,
it
Mostly, the correct
yeah.
native pronunciation is Malagasy,
Yeah.
but people don't mind if non-natives pronounce the final Y,
Mhm.
or as we call it, the final I. It's
Mhm.
the Malagasy name
Mhm.
for that letter.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Raquin mentions similar to Marlon James's Black Leopard or Red Wolf in terms of bringing in other cultures in terms.
Yeah, that's a book I've just started reading.
Hmm.
I haven't gotten. I've only read a few pages for now, but yeah, it's something I'm trying to have something like that.
Hmm.
Though I would say I'm not as connected to Malagasy culture as I would like to be.
Hmm.
So maybe it's there's always some imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Uh, Sometimes I wonder if I'm the correct person to write about that. You know,
Yeah,
my
well,
family is part French, so
Hmm.
there's always been some disconnect. I grew up a bit too French for local culture and a
Hmm.
bit too Malagasy for French culture. So
Ah.
I get to see both from outside.
Mm. Um, I think to some extent, I think both me and Scratch kind of would probably feel the same. I can only speak from my own experiences, but um, let's just say that there are particular issues that I speak about to people that I know, furries around me, which don't necessarily come across as very Afrikaans, I think would be the term.
mm-hmm.
Um, and I can definitely sympathize, particularly because yeah, it's difficult though because you want to be part of the country that you've been born into. You want to be part of and be able to fully experience things around you, but particularly, especially in myself and Scratch's cases, there's a large amount of animosity towards being in their spaces, for instance, attempting to be there, attempting to learn a bit more about it. Um, I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
Yeah,
But yeah, it
and
kind of sucks.
yeah, because I mean, yeah, both myself and Scratch being a bit more Afrikaans than I am, so I could imagine that that might also be a bit more difficult uh, at times. It does make it difficult.
But yeah, Akian, you mentioned that eh, you you feel like you don't like you're sort of caught between the French and the Malagasy worlds, and you don't know if you're sort of in the right space to tell that story. In all honesty, if you're if you don't tell the story, then other people might not necessarily. So, in all honesty, just go for it. If you think it's worth writing about, if you think it's worth incorporating into your work, then tell that story, man. Tell your story.
mm,
Yeah,
mm,
I muted myself.
yeah, you did for a bit.
I was looking for a button that I couldn't find. Um, yeah, I mean, like how when it comes to when you start the writing process and things like that, if you want to be able to speak about, in some senses, that writing process, um, what elements would you like to see written? Of course, when you talk about things like imposter syndrome, if you could get past that initial uh, difficulty, where would you be able to sort of see your writing moving towards? What kind of elements do you really want to write about?
Uh, I'd say uh, one one constant in my writing is the theme of finding places to belong. So I try to most of most of the stories I try to write follow that theme, and I'd like mm, to have something of modern stories, but with Malagasy sensitivities, like an accent of on community, on yeah. I guess that's a bit of a cause for my for that. In Malagasy culture, there's a very strong accent on belonging to a clan, to a family. So if uh, if you feel like you don't belong, it can be very difficult to live. Let's say, and I'd like to tell story about that feeling when you feel left out in a culture that emphasizes belonging to a tight group.
Hmm. Um, have Oddly enough, have you heard the? I think it's Osa, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of Ubuntu.
Uh, I've heard of it, but
Hmm.
not in detail.
The what is it? People are people through other people is the sort of
Mm.
extended perspective. Do you feel that the the cultural sort of your or the culture that you're speaking about, do you feel that it encompasses almost a similar kind of ideology? Do you feel that, because I don't know, I would be remiss to um, possibly state that in Africa, in many spaces, that seems to be one of the major um, perspectives, that idea of being together, the idea that, again, people are people through other people. Do you feel that sort
Mm.
of extends in many senses?
Yeah, that's. I'd say there's a mix of that, and uh, in many places, the ancestors are still considered part of the clan. So for for trivia, there is no bigger insult here than telling someone they don't belong in their family's tomb.
Oof.
So yeah,
Wow.
if you tell someone that, it's like exiling themselves, exiling them to considering them like a foreigner.
Mm.
Even many Malagasy people who live abroad try to find ways to have their bodies brought back to the family tombs here in Madagascar.
Hmm. Okay.
That's
And
interesting.
Yeah. Advolf asks, how would you feel about, or yeah, how would you feel about the popularization or the appropriation of your culture?
at this point, I'd say there's not much Malagasy culture uh, used by other people outside of the Malagasy diaspora. My, the only problem I have now is that, well, it's not Malagasy culture that's out there, but Western media's idea of what Malagasy culture is. Like I've mentioned Pandemic or the DreamWorks Madagascar movie.
Hmm.
Many people have no idea that those barely have any Malagasy culture in them.
Mm.
It's, there's the names, there's animal species, but the people who did this didn't consult didn't consult with Malagasy people much.
Mm.
So it's more we need to get our culture out there because people uh, think our culture is what they saw on screen. It's a bit frustrating.
Yeah. So, Adolf obviously asks, for example, what if Disney made a movie along the veins of Anna and Mulan about Madagascar rather than what
Yeah,
we currently have?
Yeah, something a little bit more researched, a little bit more um, like
Nuanced.
yeah, it takes more of the
yeah,
culture into account.
yeah. Something like Moana would be uh, close enough because
Hmm.
yeah, that's one thing people don't know much. There is not one Malagasy culture, but something like 2,000 different cultures.
Yeah.
The the country wasn't united until French colonization, and before that, it was separate kingdoms.
Hmm.
So even now, uh, my culture from where I am born is not the same as someone who was born and grew up, let's say, on the East Coast or even just a different part of the highlands.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Uh,
if there was a movie to be made, it would have to deal with the fact that the cultures have a few common elements, but otherwise they can be very different.
hmm. Okay. So James Bell asks, if a foreign friend visited you in Madagascar, what would you show them, or where would you take them?
Well, assuming assuming uh, money
Hmm.
wasn't a problem, I would make them visit the important cultural sites like uh, the the palaces and the old royal compounds here in the highlands, the tombs
Hmm.
in the south,
Hmm.
things like that. Mostly people who visit here visit for the animals and sometimes the the landscapes, but
Hmm.
the most important cultural places aren't necessarily these.
Hmm.
One common complaint here is in Antananarivo is that people don't stay here much. We're just a gateway to the rest of the island.
Hmm.
So people don't often take notice of our history or things like that.
Do you feel that that's in some sense a governmental problem as well, not being you marketed correctly? I say you because I don't like the idea of marketing, but do you feel that it would do better to market it as separate areas? The entire idea that, again, cultures are different. The the perspectives, depending on which part of the island you're on, changes completely. I'm assuming that the same goes for places like New Zealand, which, semi-integrated as it can be, still doesn't. No, I can't actually say that. I don't know enough to be able to say that.
It's not all Hobbit Town.
Yeah, or same thing with Australia. Is the fact is that like Australia and New Zealand are diametrically different from one another, especially in respect to culture. Being able to experience the culture rather than just we're here for the animals, which is something that happens in South Africa. Nobody gives a crap about, the richness of the cultures of the people that they're actually looking at and for. They just go there because lions and tigers, not
Yeah.
tigers.
Yeah, we'll look at the lions, we'll look at the giraffes.
Ooh, look at that! Look at what that person's wearing. How droll.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say the problem here in Madagascar is even the people don't realize how much we don't focus on our own culture. The colonization them caused some heavy damage to the culture, and most people who have tried to fix it don't necessarily know how to do it. So let's say we almost had to reinvent everything from scratch.
That's interesting.
So there are traditions that were destroyed
Yeah.
in the 19th and 20th centuries that we have had to reinvent from incomplete sources. So often it's something I've noticed while researching. It's difficult to sort out what used to be Malagasy culture and what is the culture that had to emerge under colonial rule.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a mess.
That's fascinating, though.
Yeah. Frans Fanon actually speaks about that quite extensively in what's it? Black Skin, White Mask. About the entire idea that with the way that I think European colonization moved, it in essence removed the entire idea of what it is to be part and parcel of the culture that you would belong to. And that the only way forward would be to just pick up the dregs of what is left of the culture that you were a part of and just try to recreate some form of story just to be somewhat connected. Oof. I'm not sure if I'm correct here in saying that. Hello?
Yeah.
Oh.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. So.
Oh. Okay. I was talking about Frans Fanon and Black Skin, White Mask.
Yeah.
Hmm?
I haven't. I'm not familiar with the name, so I have to check it.
Pretty much the major premise of what the book was about, in essence, is the idea that colonization so thoroughly destroyed cultures in Africa that people were forced to, much like if you look at, you talk about, what is it, Malagasy as a language, still isn't, it's not, what's the word? It's still influenced by European backgrounding. That the language itself is, it may be a language in and of itself. It still has much like what's the word that I'm looking for? Funagalo,
Mm-hmm.
which has elements of the languages that were there, but was in essence created by the people who had uh, full control over both government, economy, and everything like that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Mm.
Makes sense to say that.
Can we say that? Like is, or how would you state Malagasy is as a language?
Uh, say say the status of Malagasy language here
Mm-hmm.
is there is one official dialect that everyone is supposed to learn,
Mm-hmm.
but in truth, it's just something like 1/5 of the population that speaks it
Mm.
in daily life. And so, outside of the areas around the capital, most people speak two different dialects,
Mm-hmm.
their own and the official one.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say that sometimes it's easier to switch to French
Mm.
than to try and understand each other.
Mm.
There's still traces of uh, how would I say that? There's still some separation from
Mm.
old animosities.
Yeah,
Okay.
because it is very very similar to the way that South African languages have created themselves. I mean the old cultural ideologies of Zulu versus Xhosa, for instance. There's still some animosity between those two languages. Yet you get a language now in Pretoria specifically called Siprituri, and I've butchered that word completely. So I'll shoot myself outside a bit later. But the thing is that as a language, it is an amalgamation of at least a majoritively like three or four of the languages well spoken about or well spoken in Gauteng, and has actually begun to start being spoken outside of Gauteng, outside of the province itself. So, would the next step for, I guess, language acceptance or language change acceptance, because that obviously doesn't happen very often at all, especially now, even though it's supposed to. Um, do you feel that that would be the next step to be able to find almost
A common ground language, kind of.
but not a
Yeah,
it has to not be state sanctioned. It has to be something that comes from the ground up, because that's practically the only way that languages should change.
yeah,
That the people who speak them are the ones who control how the languages change.
yeah. I'd use France as an example. The the French state is trying to push French as the only language of France, and the native languages it has are considered almost foreign. So
Mm,
I'd say that that's not the best way to go about it.
mm,
Like how Brittany and Corsica
mm-hmm,
or the Caribbean islands or
mm-hmm,
Reunion Island have had to fight to get the French government to let them use the language they used to have before French was, let's say, forced onto them. So I'd say we should learn to have a balance between having a common language and allowing people to have their own,
Mm.
to keep their own,
Mm.
so they don't feel like they've been, how would I say it, absorbed by a different culture
Mm.
without their input, their specific input.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's completely fair. Yeah.
definitely.
Um. What's the word? Advolf asks, this is completely and utterly unrelated question, but if you could attend any furry convention in the world for free, which one would you go to?
That that's quite a tricky question because I don't do well in crowded areas.
Mm-hmm.
So mostly I would want to go to any convention that has people I am already familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
But uh, even then, there would still be the feeling that I'm, how would I say it,
A little bit.
that I'm just a visitor
Uh,
who isn't part of the core group. So
yeah.
Okay.
That's. It's honestly, that's. I. I. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be fun to have to like make some friends before the con kind of thing, and then maybe go join them. But yeah, it's difficult. I understand.
Yeah. Like, you can always come to South Africa. The invitation's open. We'd love to have you. Yeah.
Mm.
But yeah,
We've just crossed 9 o'clock. I think maybe should we start wrapping this up?
is there anything else that you'd like to talk about? Like, do you have any like long-term projects that you're currently working on?
Where can people find your writing or your artwork?
for writing, as I said, I don't have anything
Yes.
big finished yet, but I'm trying to write stories based on Malagasy mythology and folklore. And I did mention it's difficult to find research for that. As for my art, uh, honestly, if there is a major furry gallery, uh, I use the same name. I try to use the same name on most galleries.
So the usual fur affinity or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, Fur Affinity, Sofurry, Furry Network, and the such. On Fur Affinity, my main gallery isn't under my name, but under the name of one of my characters. But I've created an account under my name, so I could redirect to my main account.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Otherwise, I should be easy to find on major gallery sites.
Okay.
All right. If you give us a link in the Discord, then we can put that up on the YouTube site, so, or on Twitter perhaps, so that people can maybe link to your artwork.
Okay. I have it.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yes, I'm gonna pop it to here, and then it already relinks or has a link in it to. Is it Darhan?
Yes,
Yes.
that is.
Sweet.
Okay, cool. We'll link to that.
Posted. Yes. And then I should probably post it to our chat as well. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Same. Thanks for inviting me.
It was definitely a
yeah.
pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for your insights and sharing your experiences.
And we hope to chat to you again soon.
Same. Okay.
And then, yes, of course, it is now currently 9 o'clock. So within the next 10-15 minutes, we are going to be back with music on furry.fm. I'm going to be playing us, or at least playing the weekend out, at least for everybody in our line of musical things. So it'll be, the next, if I'm up in 15 minutes, then for an hour and 40, no, what am I saying? 2 hours and 45 minutes, we're going to be playing some music on furry.fm. So do keep an eye out for that. And we'll be back shortly.
All right. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. We shall see you again shortly. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.